and welcome to Question Christianity, where we, your humble host, attempt to provide some reasonable answers to tough questions about Christianity and those subjects that are related as well. So, welcome. I'm Caleb Johnston. With me tonight, to my this direction.
Hi, I'm Pete Good, working with these three gentlemen on, I don't have any affiliations other than these three. So, yeah, looking forward to tonight.
We'll just go counterclockwise.
I am Kevin Smith. I teach philosophy and learn a lot from these guys.
Oh, well, that's very, that's very generous.
Yeah.
Charles Gray's Reasonable Faith.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for your introduction. So we're going to dive into some questions tonight. We've got a few that we went ahead and laid out in advance, not softball questions. We just shot them to each other a few minutes before just so we would know what we were going to be discussing. And so we've got a few questions lined up, but if you tune in and are interested in posing a question, please go ahead, drop one in the chat. We love interacting with anyone who wants to participate and be part of this with us. So,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Pete. Take us away.
I posted our first question there on the screen, just so that we kind of give everybody a little head start on what the question is. I will say this one was posed by our current scholar on the staff. It's probably evident by the language in there. Is the relationship between cult leaders and followers synergetic? Kevin, give the lay people out there in YouTube world a little bit more way to grasp that, way to chew on that.
Yeah, well, it's undeniable that cult leaders, by definition, psychologically hold some inordinate power or sway over their followers who are real victims of that abusive power. At the same time, there can't be a cult leader without followers who prop them up or encourage them in some sense, although I think it is, distant and indirect. The difficulty of the question is, to me, how do we recognize both realities? Both the responsibility of the leader figure who's abusive in some way or another. And he really is the bad guy of the story. But how do we also recognize that as fallen human beings, sometimes we contribute to our own situations, putting ourselves in bad situations. We don't know that at the time. We don't realize what the other person's up to at the time. All these sorts of mitigating truths, I think, need to be preserved. How do we engage that without dismissing the real victim's victimhood? There are some scriptures, right, guys, that say that part of it works both ways, right?
Like, who's gonna bite first at that one?
Yeah,
I've got a whole bunch to say, so I'm gonna be polite and let someone else go first.
All right.
So, to rephrase the question there,
do they fuel each other? Do they feed each other? Doesn't make the victims not victims.
Right.
Oh.
But
we'll see what Charles has to say about that.
I think there's a point where we can, Scripture itself kind of points to that. Even Christ said, woe to the person who causes one of these little children to fall away. It'd be better that a millstone be tied around his neck and he cast into the sea than, in other words, hey, there's some culpability to the leader themselves that creates a greater
Yes.
responsibility. So, but I guess if we were to say, let's put that in the scale and let's see, there's victim, there's leader, and let's say, where does the culpability lie? Who's going to wear the heavier burden? But at the same time, how do we also help the victim also understand that they're not innocent? I think there's an innocence of victimhood that we falsely assume. Is that what you're kind of getting at?
Well, those are the sorts of questions I'm trying to rile up. I have my own thoughts. And I want you guys.
Charles, you want to go first, or you want me to dive
Yeah,
in?
please go ahead. Maybe you'll stop
Okay.
me from saying something dumb.
So, from a psychological perspective, in looking at this question, you do see that there are some common personality traits, even personality types, if you will, that often end up in situation with manipulative cult leaders. A lot of it really does go back to childhood patterns of behavior that you see from parenting in some of these situations. So the same things that make insecure adults, if you will, that should be handled through counseling and that sort of thing, are the same kind of patterns that often set up somebody for following a cult leader. Same thing you see with abusive relationships. It works very much the same way. The problem is that in order for a cult leader to have any power or sway over people, they actually have to have followers. So the cult leader's power comes from the people who are willing to follow them and to listen and do what they say. Without them, the cult leader would have no sway. That's why, there are thousands upon thousands of cults, and you never hear about them till they have enough followers to actually make a dent in things. Or if they have a small number of followers, they do something very radical. So there is that, but the issue is, I think, is that people are blinded to it while within the cult. And it's very hard to see out of those thought patterns, especially when you're put through a situation where often your sleep is disturbed. You're allowed very few hours of sleep. You're under a heavy level of thought and behavior and emotion control. So I think that we rest very little on the participants in a cult unless they are high level involved with leadership until after the fact. I think these things have to be handled with aftercare, preferably, under a good psychological professional to help people deal with these things and deal with the patterns of behavior that drew them into the cult. Is there culpability if the cult does some really awful things? One has to question that from a legal standpoint, but from a strictly personal perspective, I think that leadership stops pretty close to the top, and from there, you have to help people with aftercare on growing past those other aspects that led them to lend their respect to a bad leader.
All right. Well said.
I think one thing that might need to be said just with the phrase bad leader is sometimes with cults, they're actually not bad leaders. As far as their charisma, their ability to somehow affect people's emotions and literally just draw people to them. They kind of have a, quote, good leadership model in a lot of the world's perspective. They're just leading in a very bad, unhealthy,
morally irresponsible way.
Right, yeah. So I want to make sure we call that out, because there are people who can look at it and go, there's some leadership traits in them that cause them to be oddly phenomenal. Why is it that we, and I think that the problem is that sometimes people can use good tools to do bad things.
Yeah, people follow leaders who exhibit confidence and other things that aren't bad. Um, but also, sometimes people follow leaders precisely because of their unhealthy personalities. There's something going on there psychologically, mostly, which
Yeah,
Caleb already
what is
covered.
it that is going on there?
It's based more on persona than character, I think. I think we
Ah,
all have a tendency to do that a lot, but
yes, 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 yes. And we will excuse a lot of character problems if the leader is dynamic and has enough.
Yeah, but so why is that? Okay, so let me jump in here.
Yeah.
I read a fascinating, you know what I mean when I say I read, right?
Yes.
Right. Okay. So I read this fascinating book on leadership. I'm not like I haven't read every book on leadership, but I've read quite a few. And one of the most interesting books I ever read um, compared two leaders. For example, they had a chapter on Martin Luther and Martin Luther King, and they just kind of compared and contrasted their leadership styles. Just sometimes just for the fun of it, or sometimes to make a point. But what was really interesting is they're going over all these different leaders. Not all of them good by any means, just effective leaders for whatever. Like Hitler was in there,
Yeah.
Robespierre was in there, Martin Luther King was in there. And what was interesting is that every time, they did kind of highlight the essence of what it was. Because, I mean, if we're talking about a cult, we're not really talking about a cult that has an effective leader, because then you don't have a cult. No one's following, right? So what is it that causes people to follow this leader? And certainly some of the things that you guys have brought up are true. And you see chapters where they highlight just the charisma and the speaking power of this leader. And there's other times where, like, I think it was Robespierre who basically locked himself in a room and just wrote letters like the whole time. It was just really odd, but he was an effective leader. And so every time, in this book, you're trying to pin down, like, what is it that people are following? Because there wasn't a thing. But at the end, and the authors were pretty humble, but I think they were overly humble. They said, well, leadership is a lot of things, which is true. They said, but what we found is perhaps the one thing that links these all together is that the leaders gave the people that they were leading hope. Hope. That is absolutely profound. And even in Christianity, it's not a bad thing, right? It's a misused thing. So someone who is bringing true hope, that can be a good thing if it is true hope. And I mean, if we have a good president of the United States, we have hope that finally he's going to do what we think will bring unity or whatever is good for the nation, whatever side or whatever politics it may be. But you have hope, and so you want to follow this leader. And I think, not defending it all, neither tearing down, but I mean, Trump. I think one of the reasons that Trump supporters were so gung-ho, they had hope that this guy was finally going to do for the right, what they felt like wasn't getting done, but whatever. Same with Hitler. I mean,
Mhm.
for whatever reason, the people followed Hitler because they had great hope that this person was going to lead their country into greatness, following this huge loss in World War I, and then famine and insane inflation. It's just a horrible time between the wars there. And so, anyway, now that said, there's another part, and this is where I get a little bit more cynical than you guys. I put a lot more responsibility into the followers of the cult. Number one, because I'm just a huge believer, not believe like in the belief that we have agency and choice. And I certainly think people can be misled, but I think it's like, why were you misled? What was it that you were looking for that was the small lie that you knew you voluntarily ate that led you to believe bigger lies later on? So I'm not washing away all responsibility, but I'm not, it's like there's some culpability there. And what's really interesting is I've heard some commentators comment this, and it's really super interesting, is that if you listen to the lectures of Hitler, or you follow people on, or see what happens to great followers on Twitter, there's a feedback loop going on. So malicious, not all cult leaders, or not all leaders at all, are looking for power, but a lot are. I mean, I think some of the most damaging cult leaders are the ones that are in it for the influence and power. Like they just like that influence. And so you think about it, you're talking to like 100 people and you say something that you think is going to like really kind of fire your people up, and it just kind of it doesn't go over well. They're like, yeah, and then you say something else, and maybe it was kind of surprising to you, but they really latched onto that. You're like, oh, like these Jewish people, and then they're like, yeah, we don't like Jews. You're like, oh wow, they really don't like. I'm going to preach more on that, so to speak, right? And so there's this feedback loop as the crowd is responding. So both are culpable. They're playing this feedback loop. I really like it when you say that. And the leader says, I really like it when you like what I say. So I'm going to say what you like even more. And this happens today on Twitter, right? It's like, it's very hard to stand up and you want that feedback and you got all these followers and they really like it when you say this and that and you're posting the right thing here and you're culturally adept here. It's like this feedback loop, but it's like, yeah, the leader's taking advantage there, but the followers are also feeding back. It's a feedback loop. It's on both sides. Like what is it that you're putting your false hope into, and you know you're eating a small lie because
So,
it's giving you feedback.
And this is just a story I heard a long time ago, and I'll be brief because it's one of these long kind of moral, and I don't want to get into this moralization story, but there was a story, and it's always set in Japan or somewhere, and a young boy wanted to grow to become a jade master, so the parents took him to the closest jade master who knew how to work jade. He went there, and kind of like the whole Miyagi story where he just gives him chores, but every day he gives him chores. He hands him a small piece of jade to hold in his hand while he does these chores. Day after day, month after month, goes into his year of service for this guy, but he never learns, quote unquote, to work jade. He just does chores while holding a small piece of jade, touching a piece of jade every day. And he gets fed up and says, hey, I'm leaving. And the jade master throws a piece of jade at him and says, well, keep this to remember me by. And he grabs it. And as soon as he touches it, he goes, this isn't real jade. The moral of the story is that to know truth, you have to touch truth every day, not the lies. You can't just study the lies. You have to actually study what the truth is so you know what the truth is, because there's thousands and countless heaps of lies you could study, but you still won't know the truth. You have to know the truth. And I think the victim, quote unquote, here, their culpability is to God would be that they never heard and never learned, never sought the truth.
I totally agree with that. But see, I want to take it a step back and say, okay, but why? You know, there's a cognitive decision that goes on there, right? It's like, why haven't you been pursuing the truth? And we know it's like you hear people say, well, if I really knew what God wanted, then I'd do it. And I'd say, no, you wouldn't. We know, and we know we're Christians. We are all four of us very devout Christians, and sometimes we know exactly what God's want, and sometimes we exactly don't do it. So knowledge isn't like, why is that? Why is that? Because we know what the answer is, because we're broken, right? So there's that cognitive choice, like I'm going to choose to latch onto this because I like it, and then the secondary thing is, well, now I'm latching onto this, and so I'm not latching onto the truth. Right. I broke this out because as Kevin was talking, I was like, I mean, as many times we're going to say this, but how many times we got to go back to Romans 1? Right. So I'll just bracket the end of Romans from 18. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, internal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. And at the end of the chapter, although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but approve of those who practice them. approve of those who practice them. That's that feedback loop.
Mhm.
So
Could summarize it in the phrase people believe what they want to believe,
yes,
but you've also reduced it down to the common core fact of fallen human nature, sin nature, right?
I find myself coming back to that over, and it answers just
Yeah.
about every problem.
So I'm trying to visualize it, that's a universal common core human reality. So no matter what someone does or has done to them, that will always be true, as a given, and from the Christian view, which biblical truth, right? Um, so we got to grant it. We got to grant all that.
Mhm.
Now, coming back on the other end, um, is that the only sense in which a a member of an abusive group is culpable? I mean, we started off talking about cults, and the problem with the term cult is that you can have a group that's a cult purely in the theological sense. They deviate from historic Orthodox Christianity, right? Um, or in the psychological, sociological sense of cult, that personal power control, or both. The worst ones are both, right? Where they both are, heretical and oppressive psychologically, but you could have one or the other or both, right? So I can immediately see how this, believe what we want to believe, has to do especially with theologically aberrant groups. There's a direct line right there. You believe falsehood because deep down you wanted to, right? It doesn't take away, the twisted techniques that the leader may have used to encourage you further to sow into your sin and reap worse for you, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but what about those groups that aren't? It's not so much a theological problem as just a psychosocial oppression going on. Do we say the victims there are culpable in the same or different sense, or more or less, or not sure how the we're all sinners as easily and directly explains the followers' roles in merely psychologically abusive groups.
Well, you touched on the idea that sometimes people in these groups undergo abuse, and so I mean, to me, well, and maybe to the average person, that may seem so weird. Like, why would they put up with that? Why would you let anyone abuse you like that? I mean, you watch, well, you can watch any number of groups and documentaries, and how people are like isolated and locked up in rooms. But I mean, it's voluntary. They could have gotten away, but it's like, why didn't they? Why didn't they leave?
Well, I mean, often in the type of people who are prime for cult membership, you see patterns of behavior in childhood and adolescence where they didn't have good, strong connection with parents, and they're always searching for that kind of connection. So
Mm,
they're very apt to follow a strong leader, especially if it's a group that gives them meaning and purpose as well. When people go through deconversions, they're often seeking for some deeper meaning in life. As people go through adolescence, into adulthood, you see the same kind of thing. That's why that's a prime target for.
Vulnerability.
Right. These are vulnerable times, especially when someone's looking for a psychological or a theological answer that makes sense to them.
So vulnerability is a more contemporary term for, I think, what we see in the Gospels as Jesus calling the least or the last or the lowly. There's a lot of it's a lot of overlap in those concepts.
Mm-hmm.
We can actually see, I mean, in the later chapters of Luke, there's an instance where Jesus kind of pointing that out, and it's kind of interesting where he's pointing out there where the widow is being taken advantage of. Just the few chapters or the few verses before that, this is all fairly consecutive in how it's happening, and you see him, kind of decrying the abuses of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin, and how they take advantage of people. And one of the things he says is they devour widows. And then shortly thereafter, you actually see a widow walking up, handing in basically all she has. And he goes, look, here's a prime example where this widow is being devoured by these people who have convinced her that the way you're going to make God happy is you have to give and you have to sow your seed of faith. Might be a modern way we'll hear it said.
See, I keep hearing the same thing over and over again, which is it's this link to hope. See, I think to answer the question, I think the reason that people are willing to go under abuse, well, I mean, what did Dante say about like hell? It's like right over the entrance to hell was, abandon ye hope, all who enter here. That is, I mean, that is a very profound and horrible truth. It's like if you go, hope is gone. There isn't a time that you can look forward to the future where this is going to end. The loss of hope is perhaps the most severe and horrible thing that anyone can suffer. I mean, that's suicide, that's anything. So if you have, for whatever reason, and I believe it's partial culpability on the part of the victim, not full, I'm not saying that, but at least partial culpability, and some more than others. But the reason that these people are willing to go under abuse is because abuse is much more preferable to the loss of hope.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's like you thought, and these leaders can be incredibly charismatic. I mean, one of the things I wrote down here, it's right there, it's sloppy, you can't read it, is Mars Hill, because we've been reading about or listening to the podcast, and it's like, it's kind of the same thing. It's following that same track. Like you got this incredibly charismatic leader who's saying a lot of things that ring true, and a lot of things that are true, and a lot of things that you're kind of willing to buy the small lie. And where does that lead? But one thing it won't, for most people, is lead out the door, because to do that is to abandon the hope that you have.
Yeah, it's a trap, and yet there are elements in us.
It's the most addictive trap that you can get into.
Right.
It's like what trap is worse than the loss of hope for your entire life? Like this is the hope for my whole life.
Right. That's a core thing that we're made for from God.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Yeah.
And so I've heard one illustration put it like this, is that one of the ways that hope might be given is kind of a rat poison thought process. Rat poison is, some large percentage of it is just normal food that a rat would eat. The poison is a very small part of it. And so the hope might actually be even fairly real hope.
Yeah. Right.
A portion of a lie that takes that hope and basically.
Oh yeah. Matter of fact, I doubt. Well, it would be interesting, but I would suspect that every successful cult leader, you could go find their message and find some real truths and real hopes in what they're preaching,
especially at the beginning.
Yeah, but it only takes a little bit of rap. That was the other thing about Mars Hill. That one of the reasons I wrote it down is because I was talking about this feedback loop, and one of the most interesting things that I heard, and I really, and this is, we want to save it for later, but is how he tended to change his message over time. That really bothered me, because that's that feedback loop. He would do that. He was preaching one thing, and then he found he was actually having more success with a different message. So he changed his message. It's like, oh, wait a minute now. All of a sudden, it wasn't about you preaching a truth. It was about you gaining power and influence.
Right. There's a character issue, but you couldn't see it if you're in the middle of it.
Yeah.
Well, it was harder to see it if you're in the middle
of it. Harder to see, yeah.
But I think we're missing something important here. Feedback loops are neither good nor bad. It's just a psychological mechanism. So you could have just as well a positive feedback loop that leads to increased humility. I'm thinking
That's
of
a great
marriage, for an example.
I really
if one
like that.
spouse builds up the other one or is more humble than the other one, you can have a positive feedback loop in the sense. And you see the same thing with leaders on good teams. You have positive feedback loops of where the person produces, and the leader gives them good feedback, they produce better again. So I don't know that the feedback loop lends itself to copeability in that sense.
Well, okay,
What's the difference between a feedback loop and an echo chamber? I don't know.
Well, okay, so I absolutely take your point as valid. That rings true to me. I'm not saying that feedback loops are always bad, but the idea of a feedback loop is both people or both parts of that are feeding into it. And so feedback loop, a good feedback loop or a bad feedback loop is going to be the responsibility of everyone in that feedback loop. That's all I'm saying. Maybe at different degrees.
I hear what you're saying now. There's still behavior on either end that goes into the loop.
Yeah.
So it's going to depend on what kind of behavior you're putting in. So even if you had non-followy-ish cult members who are willing to give hard feedback at difficult times, then you could potentially derail some cults.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I didn't think about this until you said it. But you look at Achan, you look at how the Bereans were celebrated for what they did. They were basically breaking the potential for a negative feedback loop and ensuring a positive feedback loop. Like, we really like what you're saying. Hold on a second. Let me. Okay, no, it's good. I like this. Keep saying that because this is good. So let's keep this. And I have culpability here. I'm doing my part. You're doing yours. And so we got this. I really like the idea of this positive feedback loop. So
they were of noble character is the word. Noble character.
Yeah. So with that, gosh, that's so interesting. Their greatest. I don't know how to flesh this out. I got this idea, but it's like they have this hope. But they weren't willing for what they didn't want was a cheap, easy hope. It's like the cheap, easy hope is I really like what you're saying. So, okay, what were you saying? It's the other kind. It's the harder one. It's going to take some effort, and I might not like it. What I find, it's like, oh man, you're a false prophet. Dang it, I really liked you.
It's interesting because I think this just has parallels going all the way up because you look at our culture's focus on leadership. There's all kinds of leadership development programs, leadership development this, leadership development that. How many character development programs are there? Have you ever hear somebody come forward with, hey, we're working on developing character here, not leaders. We're looking at character.
Because we look for results. Pragmatism is the American poison, all right? And it infects Christians too.
Well, so
they want a certain type of leader. They want a certain type of leader by secular standards, not by character standards.
But so it's like, what's the deal with pragmatism? Why is that such a big deal? Because there's a hope in it, right? Because it works. It works for what? Whatever it is. But like, that's the hope.
Yeah, some end, right?
It works for a temporary period of time.
Yeah, it works for this world. Fine, fair enough. I mean, if you're a secularist, then by all means. What else do you got?
I hate to say it, there's a lot of church leaders that are they're very secularist. They're not. Their hope is not in the gospel. And honestly, kind of, I posted a variation of a question is kind of like we've kind of fed into this church success model, and ultimately what we've done is we said, just like you said, hey, I've got the gospel, which. I won't go into really defining the gospel, but we've because I've done it before. We've got the gospel and we've got this church success model. And the church success model, again, it works today. I get to see people. I get to see lots of folks coming in with smiling faces and leaving with this purported current life change, a surface level, potentially, maybe even a little bit deeper life change. And well, I mean,
life change, man, it's got so much hope. It just sounds good.
So, I mean, then we have to look at it and go, well, because the gospel does talk about certain life change. It talks about a transformation, a change. So how do we look at the church success model and differentiate it from a true gospel centered church?
Well, the change will be character, right? Fruit of the Spirit, not of the flesh.
Mm.
But that's, I mean, it's almost always given lip service to in evangelical church growth success models.
Mm.
But, when the rubber hits the road, that's not what gains traction. Often.
Yeah, if you're not helping people build character, and I mean, that's really what community is supposed to help do, is to help, new members, younger members, to build character in such a way that they can be successful parts of that community.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's part of a community's role in things. And if the church is focused just on superficial changes, such as, how many baptisms do we have? I say superficially in terms of looking at it in numbers, not that the baptisms are fake or I mean that in any way, but I think it started a long time ago because there's been a long focus in the church on baptisms in the moment of conversion. But there's not a lot of focus on what do we do after and have real structure for character building and for, growth in the scriptures.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I remember at one point in my early Christian life as I was reading through Proverbs, because everyone was saying how great Proverbs was. And I found it so dumb and repetitive. And it's like feeding like don't tread out a grain before the horse or something. It just didn't, it was like, of course. But I remember at a certain point, I remember it just exploding to me. And reading specifically Proverbs 15:1, and the way that just hit me square between the eyes, it just, there was something in me that, number one, showed me exactly what the standard was, showed me how short I was falling from it, and 3, there was a desire in me to want to achieve that. It was like all 3 things, like, oh, that's right, and that's not me, but I really want to be that.
Right.
See, now if you don't have those 3 things, then you get into some really nasty legalism or some false trails, right? So
Yeah.
I think, but that supernatural desire to want to please God for the sake of pleasing God is got to be the center. I mean, this is why, if I think, not at all shying away from the development of character, I just want to make sure we're pursuing Christ, and the result is character, not pursuing character and trying to throw in Christ somewhere, because he won't fit after that. It won't fit. But if you see Christ and you're just like, man, that's right. That's not me, but that's someone I want to follow for the sake of following him and glorifying him, and he must increase and I must decrease. Man, there's something supernaturally character, and it's not, it's not just that I'm handing it off like, oh, Holy Spirit just changed me. It's not me taking it. It's like, God, I want to be like this. Will you help me be like this? I need your help being like this, but I really want to be like this. I'm going to struggle, right? You have not, what is it? You have not pursued the absence of sin to the point of bleeding yet, or something like
Right.
that. It's like, man, you got to pursue that thing like until you bleed. But you won't be able to pursue it like that if you don't have that desire to really please God by what you're doing. You can't do it for its own sake. It's meaningless. That's just guilt and ugh.
So I think what I'm hearing here is that just a character development and character improvement seminar is not the core of the gospel message. I mean, because the problem is, again, we can throw hope out there, and we've got people who they love to populate the pulpit and the youth ministry, where it's, hey, I'm a character development coach. I'm a life coach, so I'm here to help you tell the truth all the time. And you want me at some point, what happens if I don't tell the truth? I mean, there still has to be the gospel there.
Right. Character is fruit, is a fruit, not the root. Christ is the root. Pursue him, be grounded in him, grow in him.
Man.
And
now
the fruit that proceeds forth from that will be gospel.
From that,
right, character. Yes, it's it's not the goal. Christ is the goal. He is the gospel.
So that's Romans.
But
sorry, go ahead.
Sign and the the symbol, the the proof, the demonstration, the sign of that is character fruit.
Through him and for his name's sake, we received grace and apostleship to call people from among all the Gentiles, and this I had this underlined, to the obedience that comes from faith. From faith. Not the obedience of faith, not the obedience that leads to faith, but the obedience that's from faith.
And because we can be obedient, but apart from faith, that's what we're lost.
What is that? Right. It's it's like that was the
dead works.
Back to Romans. I mean, I had a friend of mine gave me Luther's commentary to Romans. He gave it to me for my birthday. None of you guys gave it to me for my birthday. I read through the introduction, and then I was just hit by it, and I'll tell you what it said. And then he was like, "Hey, can I borrow that commentary?" And he borrowed it. I never saw it again. I need to go buy it. But the introduction, one of the things that Luther said in his introduction to Romans was, if we're pursuing the law, so to speak, I don't remember what it is exactly, because again, he took he took my commentary. But if we try to pursue that, even though we don't want to, then we're just exchanging the obedience for hypocrisy and lies. That one really stuck me. It's like, okay, there's no way out of this. Even if I am absolutely obedient, but I hate being obedient, then I've just exchanged one sin from the other. Now I'm just a liar and a hypocrite. Instead of being like a thief, now I'm just a liar and a hypocrite. It's like, we know how Jesus feels about hypocrites. It's like, not too good. So what's the solution? And you got to want to do these things. How do you get there? Not of your own accord. Well, not solely of your own accord. Not solely of your own accord. That's for sure.
Christ alone.
From the obedience that comes from faith. It's like all of a sudden, I think I want to go do some good stuff. And there's always that. Wow, I'm just realizing how far I've kind of strayed off that. What was the original question?
Character, because we had
it was about the cult leaders. But I guess we can't talk about character.
But we made the distinction of character is not pursued by the followers, or they're not looking for that in leaders often.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Down the spectrum, we go from extreme cults down to just dysfunctional Christian groups. There's a spectrum, right? I think
for sure.
As we go down that spectrum, so to speak,
not everyone's drinking Kool-Aid.
Right.
With the poison in
we
it.
get down to where people just aren't looking primarily for character in the leader. They're hooked and enthralled by other things, and that's whether they're theologically sound or not. But as Charles reminded us, the character itself isn't the goal. It's from Christ.
But that's the thing. It's like when you really get a grasp, kind of a glimpse of these things, you understand that as you read through. See, without Christ, without a true love for God, for Himself, when you read through the law, so to speak, it's a burden. It will flip and crush you. Right? It's like, oh gosh, I'm supposed to do that. This is the Sermon on the Mount, right? Everyone goes, oh, greatest sermon ever preached. Yeah, but it's not what you think it is. That's a flipping sledgehammer, right? To let you know that you're not even close to being close, right? You thought you were close with the law. Like these were Jews that were absolutely obedient. Like they loved anyway. So it's like a sledgehammer. Now, as a Christian who reads the law, I'm not crushed by it. I'm inspired to it partially as a promise, because we have been told that He will sanctify those whom He has justified. So I
Mhm.
look at this and go, I'm going to struggle towards, but there's a promise here that he's not leaving me alone, that he will bring me. So when I say, when I read things, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouth. I can strive towards that. But there's also this promise that he will be leading me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake.
Mm.
Right. And so I can be inspired, like, oh, okay, this is an opportunity for me to grow. I'm so thankful. So I can read, it's like I can read the law thankfully. How would you like driving down a road if there wasn't a road or a dotted line on it, and you're like, you're just going to get whacked. You're going to hit a tree. It's really nice to have the line on the road. Go, okay, I know where I am. I know what the direction is. I know where I'm going. I mean, that's what it is to not be lost. Lost isn't a lack of movement. It's a lack of knowledge, lack of correct direction of movement.
Well, this relationship between the guiding law and the gospel really goes back to answer Pete's question about whether megachurches are good at making this essential distinction and passing it on to
Yeah,
their attendees.
so hard. You get some really big churches that I think are doing some really good things.
Sure.
But I think the bigger it gets, the more challenging it becomes, one, for the leader or leaders of the church to not participate in the feedback loop of so many. That's difficult.
Right.
That's very difficult. And number two, for the people to not have hope in the church. Wow, what a wonderful, huge church we have here.
Or what a wonderful leaders. I mean,
yes,
it's the same misdirection.
Yes.
Yeah. There's a lot of, and I think this is where that culpability of the quote unquote victim may fall in. There's a lot of a focus of, I go to a right church, or I go to a church that preaches a right message. So therefore that kind of exonerates me from my sin. I'm a part of the good team.
Mm-hmm.
And in reality, I think staying faithful to the gospel, staying faithful to gospel, not just the preaching from the pulpit, but we staying faithful to the gospel, is looking at it and saying, A, the law is something I can't keep. B, but the law is something that Christ did keep on my behalf. He did the things that he was supposed to do, that he was commanded to do. He refrained from the things that he was told to refrain from. And he did it with the motive of actually wanting to do so to love and glorify God the Father. And he did that on my behalf. I don't do it, even when I do the right thing. There are times when I'm, heck, not just times, it's probably, I don't know that there's ever been a time where I just kept God's command because I just wanted to do so to love God.
Yeah,
I did
100%.
so to kind of save my own skin a little bit.
Half and half, mixed motives, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Sure. And then I keep thinking about this feedback loop when it goes wrong, the wrong use of it can actually hurt a good church. It could just unintentionally, it could hurt good leaders. Seems to work in both directions there.
Well, that's Mars Hill, isn't it?
Yeah, right. I mean,
both suffered.
Both suffered. And what if somebody could have reined in Mark Driscoll? So apparently he was an unstoppable force, personality-wise. But what if there was somebody who could actually put him in?
There was a name, I don't remember. At one point there was a name, or someone's name was thrown out of someone
but he got rid of him, so he wouldn't.
Well,
if there was someone who could withstand, the top leader, it would be a blessing for the leader. Could have, what could he have been? I mean, he could be. We don't know his destiny with God. He could be, reprobate from the beginning. But I'm just saying, functionally, when all parties don't do their jobs, they hurt all other parties.
Yes. Yep. Sin always affects more people than you think it will. Has a
So-
higher cost, affects more people.
I don't want to. Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe that raises an important question we could finish on here. What should someone do if they found out they've been following a cult leader, or cult-like leader? Like, what are kind of the next steps someone can take, both within that community and outside of that community, if they find out, okay, I see there's dysfunctional leadership within this group I'm a part of. How do I begin to address that in my own life or in the lives of those around me?
Well, you know where I'm going to go. The first thing I'd recommend is you really need to do some soul searching and figure out where your hope is coming from.
Mhm.
Because if you're putting all your hope in this leader, good luck getting out of that one, because you ain't. But sometimes just literally asking yourself that question, instead of just having like a vague thought flown around, it's like, where is my hope? Where is my hope? Is it in Christ alone? Or have I kind of mixed that and watered it down a little bit with my church, my pastor, and just kind of being honest with yourself and saying, you know what, maybe I've put a little bit too much hope here, is going to give you, I think, the strength to make whatever the correct next step is.
Yeah.
So that would be the first step, but what else is next?
Absolutely. But classically, in cult studies, classically, the individual will have to expect the inevitable isolating and further abuse upon their exit, actually, from
this fellowship.
Yeah, which can be done biblically, but in the more abusive or cultish the group is, the more the exit has to be narrated as unfaithfulness or character problem in the one exiting. It cannot ever be the fault of the group or the leader, the more cultic or abusive the group is. So, and furthermore, along the same spectrum, they'll lose the trust and fellowship of people they've grown close to, that will be made to question their character or just told not to associate with them, at all. Apart from a biblical basis. But the person should ask where their hope is, because that will prepare them for the loss of things that couldn't have their hope in. It's sad and unfair to lose.
Right. Yeah.
But it's the right first question that you asked, Charles, because it allows the next choices to be.
Well, I like what you said, because knowing what the cost is going to be, and knowing ahead of time, look at, if I leave, they're going to shame me. They're going to do this on Facebook. They're going to be dirty looks. They're going to whatever, X, Y, and Z. Okay. Now I know what the cost is. No false assumptions. It's all going to be, beautiful sunsets and walks on the beach. No, it's going to be ugly. You maybe had some culpability in entering in this. There's going to be a little cost getting out. That's just the way things work. Not saying that you're totally innocent or total victim, or the other way around. That you're totally to blame, but it's just sometimes just getting ugly. Yeah, one of the things. Go ahead.
That status of victimhood or blame, I think Caleb would agree, will be best worked out with professional help.
That's a great idea.
Where
that was going to be my one.
For all the times that we make fun of safe spaces and things like that, there's actually a place for them. It's not what our culture says it is, but the place for that would be someone trusted, professional, and mental health.
I agree with you. I just don't like it. Don't call it a safe space.
Yeah, right.
Maybe it's safe to talk to someone.
I mean, the safety's a real thing. When somebody's been abused, that's just what it means.
here's something I heard from Jordan Peterson, because you know me, I love me some JBP. One of the things that he said, and this can be really interesting and helpful. One of the things that he tells us stories. You guys have probably heard me say this before, but for the sake of our audience, you know, if he's treating someone who's has fear of elevators, what he'll do is progressively, in a way that is not overwhelming at first, but slowly get them closer and closer to the elevators. Like, just look at it from down the hall, and like, that's a lot for someone that's
Yeah.
deathly afraid of, you know, a coffin, so to speak. That's what they see. It's like, that's death. And then slowly to get in there. Now, what he says, this is to me is so fascinating. And I'm not trying to get overly psychological, but this is the way that God has designed us. So I'm not over psychologizing, but I don't want to minimize it either. Slowly, what he does is not make safe spaces, but get them to understand that they are braver than they thought they were. So this exposure therapy, people that are afraid of elevators, or people that are afraid of public speaking, if you ask them, what they'll generally say is they didn't really lose their fear. What they gained was an understanding that they are larger than their fear. They became stronger than their fear. And this is the most fascinating part, is when he does this, he will find that many times people who are going through this, like, they have a fear of elevators, once he gets into the part where they're able to kind of face their fear, they go home and they have these huge fights with their spouses. Like, what's going on with that? And the answer is, they learned that they were braver and willing to stick up for themselves in things that they weren't willing to do. So it has a cross effect. It's like, you're stronger than you thought you were. And maybe if you can stand in an elevator, you can go home and face your abusive spouse, or your abusive church, or your abusive pastor, or X, Y, and Z. It's like, that's why I absolutely 100% agree with professional counseling. But it ain't going to be a safe thing. It's going to be quasi dangerous.
Well, I'm going to say this because I think it's important to note. Aversion therapy like that could be very, very helpful beforehand if somebody's dealing with an issue, and then it helps them deal with other issues. Aversion therapy is also not the first thing you're going to put somebody into if they've come out of an abusive situation like that. That may be years down the road before somebody
trauma
can
therapy
do
is
that.
very different.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but they got to get out. I mean, if someone's stuck in an abusive relationship, how are they going to get out?
You have to rewire, you have to rewrite those patterns within the brain that have caused them to encourage abusive patterns. You have to rewrite that before you can start bringing in a lot of new information. You have to help go back to deal with the trauma before you can move forward with a lot
of the cause.
Yeah, exactly.
Every step, though, that it's like, not what was the first thing you said? You have to learn not to. There was something you just said, not to say the things that encourage the abusive behavior. I think you said
you have to go back and begin to rewire your brain.
Yeah,
because
okay.
the brain wires pathways through over and over again.
Yeah.
So a lot of times these are people who, even if the victimization is not the kind of abuse that we talk about, still the psychological damage of those patterns playing out over and over and over again have to be unwired before you can bring in new wiring to help build confidence and that sort of thing.
See, I think we're saying the same things different way. I'm not saying like jump into the elevator. Like, every step of that is, what are you ready to do that you're willing to do at this part? But there's a strength. It's like, take someone who's been in an abusive relationship, and you're right, they got this wiring. So the abusive party says something, and the wiring is to agree with that. It's like, right. I think you're wrong, and the person says, "Oh, you're right. I'm wrong about this." Like, there's that feedback. It takes real courage just to be silent.
So, real quick,
right, to make that first step. It's like, he says, "You're wrong," and just to not to disagree, just to maybe even be slower than usual. Like, instead of saying, "Yeah, it's me," it's like, "Might have been me." That just to do that takes some courage. I mean, yes, it's got to be a slow, incremental thing, but it's like, I really want to encourage that direction towards growing in strength.
Right. And I think,
because you're going to have to eventually get out of that. You're going to have to, at some point, become strong enough to leave.
I think one of the things that all four of us would agree on is that it's just in case there's somebody listening going, okay, I got to go jump in an elevator, which is not what we're saying, whatever your elevator might be. I think what we all agree that needs to come with a safe guide of professional counseling.
Yeah, right.
Preferably, we would all say
Which is
professional
not
Christian
us.
counseling. Yeah, it's not us. So please don't
Or at
use
least not
this
me.
as a we're trying to tell you to go jump in your elevator kind of thing and face it head on without the guide of a professional, preferably Christian counselor. But
Which is to say that to someone trying on the way of getting out, you're not alone. That's
Yes.
just like so many people have had your experience in different ways. No two people are exactly the same, even from the same group, but you are not alone. And there are professionals who can be your first partner in that new direction.
Whether you're still in that group or
That's right.
or have already come out of it and dealt with a lot of those consequences.
You wouldn't believe how widespread spiritual abuse is.
As an
Huge topic.
interesting thought, what would you guys think about revisiting this topic from the perspective of a professional counselor? If I could invite somebody who is a professional Christian counselor into this topic, I don't know if it would be their purview. Maybe at a later time we revisit the topic of, hey, when you're trying to exit spiritual abuse of some sort. I think that might be. What do you guys think about revisiting it later?
We'll see. I think we can talk about that off air.
Yeah. We didn't touch it. Okay, let me ask you this, Caleb. I know we're out of time, but I think you're maybe the best one I can think to answer this. We talked a lot, and there was. I feel like there was an assumption, especially on my part, there was an assumption of adulthood there. What about kids?
Yeah, you're right. We really did take it from an adult perspective. Right. Kids are all the more vulnerable, little ones, right?
And I would certainly really reel back anything I'd said about culpability when for the younger you get.
Yeah.
Thoughts, Caleb?
Right. I think you have to look at a number of factors there, including mental health as well. And when you have a lot of these factors at play, whether it's somebody who is a child, whether it's somebody who maybe is more wired like a child, whether it's someone who has a lot of other factors at play in their life that make them a more likely victim for this. I think we have to take all of that in consideration. And that's why, for me, culpability really lies with the leader and those in the direct vicinity of that leader who have access to more information than those within the general populace of these groups. So, I kind of see everybody who doesn't have access to that information more as a victim in all these scenarios. I think I've made that clear, but kids especially are absolutely 100% victims in this situation, and they have very little option. And the fact of the matter is, many of them are raised in these groups.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
So they've never had a chance to even get an outside perspective on the group sometimes.
Right. And a lot of times their trust infrastructure, their parents, their pastors, their friends, their older leaders, just simply add to, again, it's a facade and possibly an opacity towards the truth. They're not able to see the truth because all their trust infrastructure is blocking and facilitating their believing the lies.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps us up tonight, but we definitely need to continue this conversation.
No, we didn't get to the other questions. What were they? Let's tease it. Let's tease it for next time.
Oh, let's see here. There was one question that was about turning the other cheek.
That's a really good question.
It is.
I'll have to hit that one later. That's a really good one. And I think it goes far deeper than what the initial question may insinuate. Another one was on animal suffering, maybe animal abuse. Is it worse than, greater than human suffering? And how does it pose a problem for Christians? And I'm certain there's some spinoff questions it'll end up coming from
I'm
those.
gonna have to get smart on that one. Really, William Lane Craig has some good stuff on that. I'm gonna go read it up on it.
All right. Well, that about wraps us up for the night. Hope you enjoyed the discussion. We would love to have you come be a part of this with us. So let us know what kind of questions you would like to hear discussed. Yeah, we'll see you next time.
See you guys.